Hello, and my name is Alex Owiti. I'm a graduate student at USIU Africa. Today, I'd like to talk about my end semester project under the introduction of graduate studies. Based on my project, which of course is around the crisis communication. My topic is around crisis communication in the digital age as a case study. And when you look at the introduction of this particular project, crisis communication has become a critical component of organizational reputation management in the digital era. The growth of social media platforms has fundamentally transformed how crises emerge, spread, and are managed. Unlike traditional crises that were mediated primarily through conventional media, digital crises now unfold in real time, often driven by user-generated content and networked public engagement. This transformation has amplified the speed and scale at which reputational threats escalate. Therefore, in January 2022, the Kenyan operations of KFC faced significant public backlash following an announcement that the company was expecting a shortage of potatoes and could not meet customer demand. The announcement sparked a widespread criticism on social media, particularly among Kenya's highly active digital community, commonly referred as Kenyans on Twitter or KOT. The situation escalated when questions emerged regarding why the company could not source potatoes locally despite Kenya being a major potato producing country. The crisis evolved into a viral online campaign under the hashtag Boycott KFC, which generated intense debate about corporate responsibility, local sourcing, and the tone of the company's communication. Therefore, this study examines the crisis communication strategies employed during the Boycott KFC episode and evaluates how these strategies influence the escalation and longevity of the digital backlash. Therefore, the background of the problem is that organizational crises have long posed significant threats to corporate reputation, stakeholder relationship, and long-term sustainability. In traditional communication environments, crises were typically mediated through mainstream media such as newspaper, radio, and television. Organizations had greater control over the flow of information and were able to manage reputational threats through structured media engagement and control messaging. However, the emergence of digital communication technologies has significantly altered this landscape. Social media platforms have empowered stakeholders to participate directly in public discourse about organizations and their actions. This shift has created a dynamic communication environment in which crises can develop and escalate rapidly, often beyond the control of corporate communication teams. The rise of online activism and hashtag movements has further intensified the reputational risks associated with organization crises. Hashtags enable individuals to aggregate conversations, mobilize collective action, and amplify public criticism across digital networks. In many cases, such campaigns attract widespread attention from traditional media, further magnifying their impact on organizational reputation. In Kenya, social media has become a powerful space for public engagement and accountability. Kenyans users of the platform X have earned a global reputation for their ability to mobilize online conversations around social, political, and corporate issues. This digital activism is often criticized by humor, satire, and coordination messages, which can quickly amplify public criticisms of organization. The Boycott KFC campaign emerged within this context in early January 2022, and KFC announced that it had run out of potatoes to supply the chain. Due to public frustration that intensified when statements attributed to company representatives suggested that locally produced potatoes did not meet the company's quality standards, many social media users interpreted this statement as dismissive of Kenyan farmers and local agricultural capacity. As a result, the hashtag boycott has began to trend on social media, with thousands of users expressing their dissatisfaction and calling for a boycott of the brand. The crisis quickly evolved beyond a supply chain issue into a reputational crisis involving national sentiment, corporate accountability, consumer activism. The incident also attracted significant attention from communication professionals, industry analysts who questioned the effectiveness of the company's crisis communication strategy. The boycott KFC case highlights the complex challenges organizations face when managing crisis in digitally connected environments. It illustrates how communication missteps, delayed responses, or perceived insensitivity can intensify public backlash and prolong reputational damage. Consequently, the case provides an important opportunity to examine how digital crisis communication strategies influence stakeholder perceptions and the trajectory of reputational crisis. Therefore, the statement problem for this case is that the increased influence of social media significantly transformed the dynamics of crisis communication. Organizations are now expected to respond quickly, transparently, and empathetically to crises that unfold on digital environments. Despite the growing importance of digital crisis comms, many organizations remain inadequately prepared to manage crises that originate or escalate on social media platforms. Communication strategies, therefore, while effective in traditional media environments, may not be suitable for digitally networked contexts where information spreads rapidly and stakeholders actively participate in shaping public narratives. The boycott KFC hashtag crisis in Kenya provides a clear example of these challenges. What initially appeared to be a supply chain disruption quickly evolved into a major reputational crisis driven by social media activism. The public relations suggested that stakeholders perceived the company's communication as inadequate, insensitive, or poorly managed. This perception contributed to the widespread adoption of the boycott hashtag and prolonged online criticism of the brand. Although crisis communication has been widely studied in Western contexts, there is limited empirical research examining digital crisis communication in African markets, particularly within Kenya's vibrant social media environment. Existing literature also provides limited insight into how multinational corporations manage crises involving national sentiment and online consumer activism in emerging economies. Therefore, the central problem addressed by these studies is the lack of empirical understanding of how digital crisis communication strategies influence the escalation, the longevity of social media-driven crises in Kenya. Specifically, the study seeks to examine how the communication responses employed by KFC affected stakeholder perception and the progression of the boycott KFC campaign. The purpose of this study is to examine crisis communication in the digital era using the boycott KFC hashtag campaign in Kenya as a case study. The study seeks to analyze how digital crisis communication strategies deployed by KFC influenced the emergence, the escalation, and longevity of the boycott campaign on the social media. The study also aims to explore how stakeholders perceived the organization's crisis communication responses and how the perceptions affected public trust and brand reputation. By examining the interaction between organizational communication and stakeholder reactions, the research seeks to provide insights into the effectiveness of digital crisis communication. Ultimately, the study aims to contribute to a deeper understanding of crisis communication practices in digitally connected environments and to identify best practices for managing reputational crisis in emerging markets. My research questions, and one of the main research questions would be, how did KFC Kenya's digital crisis communication strategies influence the escalation and longevity of boycott campaign on social media? Specific questions will also be around how did the boycott KFC crisis emerge and evolve on social media? What digital crisis communication strategies did KFC Kenya employ during the crisis? How did the timing and effectiveness of KFC Kenya's responses affect the escalation of the campaign? How did stakeholders perceive KFC Kenya's crisis communication efforts? What impact did the crisis communication approach have on consumer trust and brand confidence? And what best practice can be derived for digital crisis communication in Kenya? My hypothesis is around ineffective and delayed digital crisis communication by KFC Kenya significantly contributed to the escalation and longevity of boycott KFC hashtag campaign on social media. My rationale is that this study is necessary because the growing influence of digital media has transformed how crises affect organizations and their reputations. In modern communication environments, crises often originate and escalate on social media platforms, where stakeholders' voices play a critical role in shaping public narratives. The boycott KFC hashtag crisis presents a unique opportunity to examine how digital crisis communication strategies influence stakeholder perceptions and crisis escalation in Kenya. By analyzing this case, the study addresses a gap in existing research on crisis communication within Africa context. Furthermore, the study provides insights in how multinational organizations operating in emerging markets can adapt their crisis communication strategies to respond effectively to digitally mediated public scrutiny. The significance of this study has several reasons. First, it contributes to academic scholarship by expanding research on crisis communication within the context of African digital environments. Much of the existing literature on crisis communication focuses on Western context, leaving a gap in understanding how crises unfolding in emerging markets. Secondly, the study provides a practical insight of communication professionals, corporate leaders, and public relations practitioners. By examining the boycott KFC hashtag crisis, the research identifies lessons and best practices for managing reputational crises in social media environments. And finally, the study contributes to broader societal discussions about corporate accountability, digital activism, and stakeholder engagement. Understanding how organizations respond to public criticism can help promote more transparent and responsible corporate communication practices. The theoretical framework for this study is guided by situational crisis communication theory developed by Timothy Combs. Situational crisis communication theory provides the framework for understanding how organizations should respond to crisis based on the level of responsibility attributed to them and the reputational threat they face. Situational crisis communication theory builds on attribution theory, which suggests that stakeholders seek to determine the causes of crisis and assign responsibility accordingly. When stakeholders attribute high responsibility to an organization, reputational damage is likely to be more severe. The theory classifies crisis into three main clusters: victim crisis, accidental crisis, and preventable crisis. Each cluster represents a different level of perceived organizational responsibility and requires different communication strategies. Situational crisis communication theory also emphasizes the importance of crisis response strategies such as apology, corrective action, stakeholder engagement. These strategies help organizations mitigate reputational damage and rebuild trust with stakeholders. In the context of boycott KFC crisis, situational crisis communication theory provides a useful framework for examining how stakeholders attribute responsibility to the organization and how the company's response strategies influence public perception. The scope of this study focuses on boycott KFC crisis that occurred in January 2022. The research examines the digital crisis strategies employed by KFC Kenya, analyzes how these strategies influence stakeholder perceptions and the progression of the crisis. The study adopts a qualitative case study research design. Data will be collected from multiple sources, including social media content associated with the hashtag boycott KFC, public statements issued by the company, media reports, and expert commentary. The research focuses specifically on digital communication dynamics and does not examine the operational aspects of the supply chain issues that triggered the crisis. Some of the terms that are defined in this particular study include crisis communication, digital crisis, hashtag activism, stakeholders, and reputation. Therefore, the chapter summary introduced the study by outlining the background, problem statement, and purpose, and research questioning guiding the investigation. It also discusses the rationale and significance of the study, highlighting the importance of examining digital crisis within Kenyan context. The chapter further presented the theoretical framework guiding the research with particular emphasis on situational crisis communication theory. Finally, the scope of the study and the key definition were provided to clarify the direction of the research. The next chapter reviews examining literature on crisis communication, social media dynamics, and digital activism to provide deeper theoretical and empirical foundation for this study. Thank you.